Did you sell the phone? Is it how? It's reset?
No, I had to change the codes. All right. So, okay. So here. Okay, what I'm also going to do, baby, is I'm going to run this camera and just record everything. So, if there's anything broken here, they have the recording. You can just put it online afterwards. You know, just for a record.
Okay.
All right. So I think I'm back to way.
One I need to be careful is here, make sure this is live, the Excel connection, and the sound is coming. Okay.
So be careful when you're using this microphone. So you're talking to everybody.
Oh, okay, okay, I see.
Stickers. Let's go. Hello.
Yes, we're sitting back here. And the time is over there. Yes, this is us. No. Sorry, timekeepers here.
Timekeepers here? Right there for us.
No, you can sit there, change it now.
Which side do they?
It would be great if prop was on this side and op was on this side.
Props? Props over here.
Yeah.
Right, everybody out. So we are currently live streaming. So we're actually live. So the microphone is here.
I think the timekeepers are there, but you can just use that. Thank you. Just pull the chair.
Microphone for live streaming is right there. So any smack you talk about speakers will go out.
Chairs we can put
We should probably tell that to the audience and tell them to be quiet. The mic is the back. Let's say like
The audience starts in 3 minutes. Quick mic check.
Mic check, mic check. Hello.
Hello.
Morning, Adele.
Is this correct?
Right, guys, please remember we are live streaming. The microphone is in the back there. So any smack you talk about speakers on the stage will go out live, okay?
Hello.
Yes.
Can I just use my own timer? Do they have to be able to see it?
No, they need to see it. Greg, ask Mr. McGuire. Hang up right now. Timer up. Dr. McGuire. Yes. Oh, the timer's up there. I don't know where those are. I don't know why they're up there. I guess that's for extra.
So in the back, Andrew or Bernie, can you guys announce the teams at the end?
SAS red, proposition, ISM.
SAS red is opposition. ISM yellow is opposition. I can do it.
You don't need to know speed order, anything else. Yeah, I don't know.
Do you want me to announce the motion as well? Yes. Okay. I see the motion.
Video plus slides.
Yes. Okay, everybody, welcome to semifinals. So the motion is this House prefers that college admissions adopt test optional policies as opposed to test required. So today on side proposition we have SAS red, and on side opposition ISM yellow. back. Today we have our panel of judges who can introduce themselves.
Micah Cook.
Maya Rubin. Stephanie Lin.
Okay.
If you want to introduce yourselves and what speaker order you're doing for the people that are watching on live stream, that might be nice. Your parents might want to hear your names. So go ahead.
Monica Mitchell, Prop 1.
Zimin Lee, Top 2.
Jaysha Sharma, Prop 3.
Kyle Almoran, Op 1.
Anushree Gaikwad, Op 2. Leandria Arun, Op 3.
I think SAS and IASAS can both agree that college applications have gotten more competitive now than ever before. From the comfort of our international private schools, we panicked as we saw acceptances drop. The reality is, colleges only got more competitive for the privileged few because they finally were accessible for the underprivileged many. Proposition supports a world in which everyone has equal right to opportunity, so proud to propose. I will do a couple of things in my speech today. First, I will go over some key points of setup. Then I will give our first substantive about why we believe that SATs and the SAT and ACT is inherently an unfair measure of intelligence. And then I will talk about why they contribute to unfair reading time after the college application process. And then my second speaker, Zimin, will talk about the signaling effect. So first then, on some key points of setup. First of all, what do we think a world would look like without SAT scores? We think that without SAT or ACT scores, the vacuum would inherently be filled by other types of academia because they're the best direct comparative. For example, we think that if a college reader can look at your SAT score, they'll likely look at things like classes, the class rigor you've taken, or the grades you've gotten at your high school. Second of all, we think that colleges are companies that are profit-driven and therefore want to be as efficient as possible in the reading processes. What this means is that when presented an opportunity where they have one singular direct point of comparison for all applicants, they are very likely to use that direct comparison to cut corners. Right, third of all, we think that these SAT and ACT type tests are these 3-hour-long tests that are very, very hard for neurodivergent kids to sit through, but also they come with their own costs, right? Applying to take these tests is expensive, transportation to get to these tests are expensive, and internet access is expensive. There are many burdens that happen once a student decides to take these tests. Fourth of all, we think inherently then to this debate, the delta of this debate is kids who either can't take the SAT test or who wouldn't have submitted their SAT or ACT test score if they had the option not to do so because the rest of the debate is symmetrical on both sides of the house. The problem this motion is trying to solve then is that the college system simply does not provide equal opportunity, and the yardstick of this debate therefore is which team can best prove that they create the most equity in the college application system on their side of the house. So then to my first substantive about why we think SAT and ACT scores are an inaccurate measure of intelligence. The thesis of the substantive is that the SAT and ACT scores are inaccurate measures of intelligence because when students without resources are forced to take an exam or don't have the resources to do well on that exam, I'll take that in a second, their intelligence is undervalued, which makes college more inaccessible. I'll take that POI now.
Do standardized tests measure intelligence or academic achievement?
I think that they are designed to measure intelligence. We think that insofar as colleges use the SAT or ACT as a direct yardstick to measure intellectual capacity, if we can prove why that measure is inaccurate, the purpose of SAT or ACT tests falls. So what happens then when an underprivileged student takes tests? First of all, these tests are really expensive and they're really, really long tests, right? You're asking kids, hey, take a day off work so you can go drive 3 hours to this testing center, spend 4 hours taking the test, and drive 3 hours back home. That's really hard to do, and these tests are really expensive to sign up for. A lot of kids then who come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are more likely to just simply not take that test at all, which means that their intelligence is never reported to these colleges, and they're not allowed to apply to these colleges ever. Inherently, that's very bad because you're keeping the application pool small to only the privileged elite. That is not equal opportunity. No, thank you. Second of all, what do we think happens when these kids do choose to take these tests because there's literally no other way in opposition's world to apply to college? We think that even if they can take these tests, they don't have the same access to resources as the other students do, right? They're likely to underperform because they can't afford something like tutoring, right? For example, 6 of my friends literally fly out to Korea last year so that they can have fun in Korea and study for the SAT. They came back with a 100-point increase in their SAT scores. The vast majority of the world here just simply cannot take a flight out to Korea because they feel like it or because they want to do better on a test, right? That means that these kids' intelligence are vastly undervalued, which is very inherently unfair because we think that these kids deserve an equal opportunity to show just how smart they are, which already exists in their school systems, right? We think that if you force these kids to take these tests and they don't do well on the test, that's very easy for a college to say, oh, they're simply not as intelligent and they seem less qualified. Right, but then on the comparative, why we think we're so much better in a world where we instead use things like grades and academic rigor to look at a student's ability. Right, we think it's much easier for underprivileged kids to perform well or excel in the schools in things like academia or class rigor because it already exists in an institution that they're already part of, meaning their high school. Right. Right? For example, like when you study for a math test, you already have resources like free homework from your teacher. You already have your teacher you can ask questions to after class. When you have to go outside your institution to take something like an SAT test, that becomes a lot harder because those resources aren't free and constantly available. But then on the second reason that we think that this is inherently unfair is very simply because of kids that live with neurodivergency, right? For a lot of kids, like the SAT and ACT simply will not deliver their academic intelligence because of neurological differences. No, thank you. Right, first of all, most children who take the SAT cannot get extra time or extra accommodations if they live with a neurological difference like ADHD. But even then, when the privileged few have the resources and the ability to spend thousands of dollars on something on an ADHD test, we think it's very unlikely that they are able to do well on these tests. A couple reasons why. ADHD, ADD, and things like BPD manifest in ways outside of the testing room. It manifests in taking 10 extra hours to study for your test. It manifests in having to go to your teacher for extra help after math class. In an institution, that's largely okay, right? Because when I go to the testing center to get extra time, I also get to visit my math tutor and be like my math teacher at school and be like, hey Dr. Polawan, I'm really struggling. Can you explain this concept to me one more time? Because it takes me longer to learn. If someone does not have that fundamental right to access because they're forced to take a test that exists out of their institution, there's simply no resources to help reinforce their study methods, and those neurological differences are allowed to manifest in a way that severely undervalues their intelligence. The hundreds of hours, in addition to the hundreds of hours they're forced to spend in school, we'd rather continue to allow them to continue to work well within that institution than go out of their way to take the SAT, which is outside their comfort system and lacks the support system of teachers and existing materials. But then on to my second substantive about why colleges that use SAT and ACT inherently have less reading time. The thesis of the substantive is that after students apply, the SAT and the ACT pose significant burden on other aspects of their application because they're less likely to be properly considered. Right? I've already proven to you why fewer kids apply when the SAT and ACT test exist, and also what happens when these students with lower resources or neurodivergence are likely to submit their tests and why those tests are lower. But then what happens when those applications are actually done? What happens in the college reading room, right? We actually saw this Harvard Law School that revealed that colleges literally put students in buckets based on their SAT score, right? So they go, oh, this person got a 1500, they go in bucket A. This person got a 1450, bucket B. This person got a 1400, they go in bucket C. And if you were in a lower bucket, you quite literally get less reading time on your college applications, which means that you could have spent hundreds of hours on something like your essay because that's the only place in your college application where your privilege is not shown through and you wrote the essay yourself, and the college readers simply aren't going to give it the time of day because you're already in that lower bucket. We think that really undervalues all the other work that these underprivileged kids are already putting into these college applications. But then comparatively, why do we think that we're so much better? When you take away ACT or SAT tests, colleges are forced to not be able to bucket students anymore because they know that every high school has a different system of grading, right? Some high schools have a 1-to-9 system, some schools use pluses, some don't use minuses, and so it's very likely then that they have to view these students in their context of their specific high school, and because your peers in your high school are the best comparative for how well you performed, we'd much rather live in a world where you are directly compared to them and where you have much, much more equal opportunity. So proud to propose.
student from Ecuador, faced with a debilitating illness for the past 2 years. She has been unable to spend her time efficiently in order to undergo formal schooling due to being strapped to a hospital bed. However, much to her dismay, the school does not have the support necessary in order to provide her access to some of the best universities. She does not have the resources needed in order to get into these universities. Hello, I'm the first speaker for opposition, and today I will prove why proposition's case and will submit SAT scores based on what they believe gives them the best chance, which we will discuss is a problem in our later arguments. Next, we'd also like to define the word standardization, in that develops in comparison with a standard and adherence to a specific and certain guideline. So I will not be taking those. Now I want to describe exactly what occurs in opposition's world. In opposition's world, test-required policies must be submitted alongside applications, and it hence is a prerequisite into providing consideration for these students. But we would like to prove why this is not necessarily a bad thing. Because in our counterfactual, where it means that every student has an equivalent metric to be assessed by in applications. This does not exist in proximal, because say for example in their alternative of using grades and class rigor as a method, grades and class rigor are measured differently in different education systems. Whereas with standardized test scores, these apply and are universal, and hence can be used by universities universally. Our burden of proof as opposition is to prove that standardized testing improves the quality and fairness of college admissions decisions, and our yardstick, and what we believe this debate should be won by, is the side that best supports a holistic and fair assessment and evaluation of each applicant in the process. I'll take that after this, not the only and are supplemental to other methods, other qualitative methods of choosing our students as applicants. Yep.
Do you support students dropping out of school to study for standardized tests?
We do not support students dropping out of school, and we also prove why that does not necessarily happen in our site. Additionally, they said that the sample of neurodivergent students, in that these students are inherently disadvantaged with the SATs as a whole. First of all, when we make SATs required, we presume that in our world, high schools will provide students with the resources and support necessary in order to do well in these SATs. This means that high schools will cater to these neurodivergent students with ADHD, I'll take that later, students with ADHD, and will provide them the support and resources necessary in order to do well and in order to ensure that their high school remains competitive in the applications process. Hence, their wording in the neurodivergent example exists in a vacuum, and it's actually them that does not take into account the full holistic view of a student and a student's unique experience in contrast and in comparison with the students around them. Yes?
Historically, when colleges did not have test optional policies, very few high schools actually allowed students to have the ability to practice with an SAT in their high schools.
This is because in the past, these test required policies were not universally applied to all schools, and there were some schools that used loopholes to escape them. With that being said, let's now move on to our first argument, which is that it levels the playing field between students of different socioeconomic classes. Now, I'd like to get to why exactly this occurs, in that in our world, in opposition's world, we have a more contextual evaluation of students. Look, in opposition's world, it is true that wealthy schools will have higher SAT scores. Their students will have SAT scores. Many already do. And this is due to, I won't be taking any more POIs, and this is due to the fact that they're able to take the test multiple times and have more access to resources that help them to improve on the test. However, as already mentioned in my rebuttal, this does not, when you make tests required, this issue does not happen because students get the support and resources and help needed from the universities and are able to make more conscious and more informed decisions that help them get into university. I'd like to use a sort of example here. Even if a student of low socioeconomic status has a lower SAT score in our world, it is evaluated in their person as defined by Martha in our introduction. And ultimately, all these factors will play a more important role into how these students are being picked and chosen by universities, helping both the student and the university in the long run. Additionally, my second subpoint for this first argument is that the first was contextual evaluation. Is that the ability to improve on a test is more equal between students of different educational backgrounds. In proposition's world, for example, test optional practices disincentivize students who are weaker at raw testing as a whole to submit their scores. If they are ingrained with this idea that's if their score is low, that they will not submit their score, then automatically makes the SAT a far more elitist program as a whole, especially with the idea that students take it based on them having the best chance. That ultimately it creates a world in which the SAT is just a means for students to pad their stats and further the gap and the divide between socioeconomic classes. Ultimately, what proposition's world is sounds great in theory, but when considered in a bigger picture, when considered with how universities take into account what students they'd like to accept, and when considering what is more holistic and fair assessment in ensuring that these students are able to get the universities that they both want and what the university wants, then it is our side, opposition, that wins this debate. Thanks very much.
When we say that the SAT is designed to measure intelligence, we're not saying it actually measures intelligence. Because let me give you a quick history lesson and talk to you about the history of the SAT. It was designed by a prejudiced white man to measure raw intelligence by asking questions like, take the number of prawns on a meat fork, square it, and subtract the number of prawns on a salad fork. Questions that rely on their families to be well off, to have a comprehensive and privileged education and upbringing that a struggling African American kid in Harlem has never had the access to, and simply trying to measure intelligence, sure, but it has failed and still fails to be an accurate measure of intelligence or academic aptitude. Perhaps the racism and discrimination is more implicit now. Perhaps it hides under a veil of meritocracy. But its discriminatory nature and disgusting premise cannot be hidden for any longer. So proud to oppose. Yes.
Many elite academic institutions in the United States, for example, Harvard or Yale, also do not accept African American students. Should those educational institutions also be shut down?
No, but I'm going to stress, I think one of the key problems on their side is that they're very American-centric. In my later substantive, I'll talk to you about how there's more to the world than just America. First, on rebuttals. We told you very clearly that the SAT isn't an effective measure of educational aptitude. They say that SAT is actually better than our comparative of grades because it's standardized and grades are different everywhere. I have two responses. First, on your side, you don't use SAT in a standardized fashion anyways because you say that SAT is considered in the context of your applicant pool. So I don't think it's standardized in your usage regardless. The second response here is that when you're looking at grades from a perspective of an admission officer in university, admission officers are oftentimes assigned to regional locations, meaning they're very familiar with the applicants and the high schools of their region. Therefore, they're very familiar with the grading systems in which their applicants are coming from, so we think that they're able to very accurately see who are the kids who are standing out within their context, within their region. Therefore, we think grades are a very effective measure of seeing your educational aptitude, of seeing if you have a lot of potential, of seeing if you're a diamond in the dark, seeing if you're an underprivileged kid who simply haven't had the opportunity to get the same education as the wealthy kids on your side. All of this is to say, we think grades in context is very sufficient in measuring academic aptitude and ensuring social mobility happens, and making sure that the kids who are underprivileged are able to stand out. Secondly, they say, in response to our new diversion point, is that actually they have enough support already, the support systems in place in these schools. We tell you that perhaps perhaps that is true in SAS, perhaps that is true in ISM, but go to a public school in Denver where the family income is below 20K and see what support is offered for neurodivergent kids. We think it is very non-existent. We give you a lot of mechanization in our first speaker of explaining precisely why, even if you can get accommodations on the SAT because you're neurodivergent, the tests in the first place are absurdly expensive. It is very difficult to get a diagnosis. It is very expensive to pay these private doctors. Even with a diagnosis, even if you're able to pay for these things, even if you muster up a month, no thank you, even if you muster up a month of income, you might not even get the diagnosis in the first place because sometimes these neurodivergencies just don't show up on tests. So, I think that addresses the substantive material coming from their side and reconstructs our arguments. The last thing I want to talk to you before moving to my constructive is on how they completely dropped our filtration point. We tell you this filtration substantive, our entire substantive, it is very, very important because we tell you if you want holistic admissions on either side, if you want kids to be considered for the merits of their application, for the merits of their talent, for the merits of their ability, then they better get the same consideration as everybody else. At the point in which you have an SAT score be a metric, and a school where they get 80K applicants a year, we tell you the precise mechanism in which admissions is decided is they separate kids into different buckets based on different tiers based on SAT scores. The higher tiers get a much more comprehensive read. They get around 10 to 15 minutes, whereas if your SAT is below a certain threshold, you may get less than 1 minute for your entire application with essays, with your transcript, with your family background. We tell you when you have an SAT score, because of the filtration process, if you're a disadvantaged kid with a worse SAT score, because you don't have the same resources, you don't have the same support, you literally get overlooked. You don't get holistic admissions to the same point as a wealthy kid might, because your admission officer literally isn't spending nearly as much time on your application. Okay, I think that's completely big winning. Either way, they have to address that later on. Okay, then I'm going to move on to my team's third substantive about the signaling effect. The thesis of the substantive is that when colleges require SAT scores, it signals to the world that these standardized testing are valid measures of intelligence or academic aptitude or ability, regardless of the reality of the situation. Why? Because the world looks to these universities as academic institutions that know what they're doing. If they say that the SAT is just as valuable as your grades, as the impacts you've made in your community, as the jobs you've held down to support your family, and what your teachers and counselors say about you, it signals that the SAT is in fact that important. Why is this such a problem? Because we tell you then, the signaling effect signals to other organizations, like scholarships and internships and jobs, to look at the SAT or standardized testing as a means of measuring intelligence. Furthermore, we think this filtering effect becomes even more prevalent. If they know you're a recent high school graduate because you couldn't afford college, for example, they're going to filter your application based on the SAT. Even if admission officers are able to look at the SAT in context. We tell you a random HR personnel that's hiring people without decades of experience in the educational sector likely isn't going to look at the SAT score with nearly as much nuance. They're just going to think, your score is below the 60th percentile in the country, even though that's in the top 1 percentile of your county and your region, we're going to dismiss your application because we don't think you're as talented. All of this is to say, the disadvantaged kids on their side get even more disadvantaged and overlooked. You can't get these scholarships or internships nearly as easily as our comparative, because without it, we think you are more focused on your other attributes. Then, onto our team's fourth substantive. We think holistic admissions is great. But outside of the US, many educational systems only consider test scores and strips away the incentive of teams to genuinely pursue their development. Because what's going to be the same on both sides? We think holistic admissions is great because it allows disadvantaged kids to focus on supporting their family and be credited for their hard work instead of the family sacrificing everything so that the kid can crack the JEE or the Gaokao. It allows kids with genuinely world-changing talent to focus on changing the world through developing companies or doing scientific research and not be worried about hurting their higher education prospects. And it allows for non-traditional excellency to be recognized. But the reality is, when you only look at the US, you ignore the fact that by implementing a test optional policy globally, we move countries like China and India into adopting holistic admissions as well. Therefore, since the Gaokao and the JEE isn't the only metric to be considered, we think the impacts here are very significant. Because one, the strain on families is going to be a lot less. Because what happens in China and India when they praise the Gaokao or the JEE or the NEET as the only way of social mobility. Millions, yes, millions of families, because there are over 2 billion people there, literally sacrifice everything they can to make sure their kids can pass these exams. Perhaps a few kids per county can make it, but many hundreds do not, and their families has been so worse off for it. By doing this, we do better for the kids globally. So proud to propose.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Before I'll be going into my second and third substantive arguments, I would like to address some rebuttals that we would like to make on the arguments made by side proposition. Their third argument focuses on the signaling effect and how by making standardized tests required in schools, it signals that standardization accurately measures academic intelligence. We would like to bring it back to the fact that this is not about measuring intelligence. It is simply about measuring academic understanding. And this will be covered in our further arguments, but to this we ask the question, how do kids from lower socioeconomic statuses afford the scholarships and internships they talk about if they can't afford to miss a single day to take the SAT? How do they have the resources to apply for these scholarships and internships if they don't have the resources to take the SAT? How does their side promote access to education for lower socioeconomic statuses if they don't specify how they have the access to improve their other aspects of their application? Moreover, they talk about how the SAT and other standardized test scores. Yes.
Should the SAT also be considered for scholarship for jobs?
That is not what we are stating. We are simply mentioning other aspects of a student's application that you have mentioned, such as scholarships and internships, which are a part of their extracurriculars in their college admissions application. Moreover, they talk about how the SAT is going to be an equal part of is going to be equally considered alongside extracurriculars. To this we say, it is not equally considered, it is just another supplemental aspect of the application. Nowhere does a college admissions officer state that essays, extracurriculars, and the SAT score as well as grades are going to have equal weightage within the college applications process. It is simply a way for students to enhance their application alongside their school's grades. To this we say, what if the neurodivergent kid struggles to get good grades in school? Does that mean that grades are going to be the only deciding factor in their application? To this we say, we need standardized test scores in order to ensure that these children have the ability to prove their academic worth in a manner that is separate from just the school system, the subjective school system that they are centered in. Moreover, they have failed to address our point about how grade inflation does not exist on their side of the house. Because on our side of the house, we notice that when schools have only school grades considered instead of just standardized test scores, they have the natural incentive to inflate school grades because they have more weight in college applications. If the only quantitative measure of your academic ability is going to be your grades in school, then these grades naturally become inflated. To this, we give the example of IB predicted grades, which might become more lenient and over-predicted when they are the sole determinant factor instead of standardized testing scores. And this ties me into my second argument, which is about guaranteeing a basic level of academic proficiency in the relevant area of knowledge. Our first subpoint is about how it sets a benchmark level of knowledge. All education systems across the world are different. The AP has different requirements, the IB has different requirements, the SSC board has different requirements. But when we have standardized tests like the SAT, what it does is that it signals to the individuals that they must have a basic understanding of certain things. So for example, the SAT math curriculum tests math knowledge that's learned in the first 2 years of high school. And this ensures that students must be proficient with at least basic knowledge to ensure that they can succeed in the institution. This means that even if their school grades from 10th grade in math don't align with the school that they're applying to, if they're not that great, they can still prove their academic intelligence and understanding through their SAT score by showing that they actually understand these concepts. It gives students a second chance. It proves that your transcript grades don't always define your worth, and they're much more than that, and they can be enhanced and proven through these standardized testing scores. Our second subpoint is about how it helps universities identify how to best academically support students and recommend courses better suited to their needs in areas that they need to improve on or can do well on currently. So one example of this is, for example, you submit an SAT score to a university and they find that your math skills, particularly at algebra, are particularly low. What they can do is they can recommend courses that are more tailored to enhancing this particular skill of yours in university to ensure that you have the most successful possible outcome. When we rely simply on grades given by schools, what we're doing is, number one, they're subject to for example, if you're constantly asking your English teacher questions on how you can do better in class, therefore you get a better English grade, that does not necessarily tie into the SAT, where the SAT is more quantitative and more objective and more standardized in the sense that it tests your current knowledge on specific concepts. Yes?
How much time do your admission officers spend on applications?
The time spent on applications is not the question here. The question here is how holistic is the entire process? And this is exactly what we're focusing on throughout the entire debate. This leads me to my next point of how it makes education not only more accessible, but more tailored to the needs of individual students when we're able to understand their particular strengths and weaknesses through a benchmark metric. Our third substantive argument is about how it's a component of holistic admissions. So our first subpoint in this is going to be talking about qualitative versus quantitative data provided to universities. Inside Proposition's world, the only quantitative data provided to universities is a grade submitted by an individual schools, which, as we have mentioned, might be subject to inflation. Now, when we have this added metric of an SAT or standardized test score, what it does is it allows universities to equally consider both qualitative and quantitative data. And mind you, the qualitative data, such as essays and extracurriculars, are more biased towards students of higher socioeconomic statuses. Why? Because they have the ability to constantly get their essays and extracurriculars revised and supported by counselors and external counseling, college counseling companies. Now, on our side of the house, we focus on disadvantaged students. Why? Because we give them a chance to prove their academic achievement independent of the school system. The question here is about enhancing your application in a manner that solely does not rely on grades. And for this, we give the example of a student facing mental health issues, which have negatively impacted their transcript. Due to this, they're going to apply for supportive material, such as exemptions. But the actual evaluation of these exemptions can be enhanced by an additional SAT score that more accurately reflects your academic knowledge at the current period in time. So the standardized testing actually attests to your real academic potential. Now, tying this back to our counterfactual, we believe in a world where every student knows that they have a quantitative metric that can be objectively used and assessed in college applications to display their current academic level of understanding. And this ties back to our first argument about how we focus on leveling the playing field through contextual evaluation. The score of the neurodivergent kid is not going to be evaluated just because it's 900 out of 1600. No, they're going to take into account your personal factors, your health. They're also going to be taking into account your regional factors and your own context. The focus here is on context, and for side proposition to state that this is not the case is simply incorrect, because in a college admissions process, they always focus on your individual context. And this ties back to why we are the most accurate side in proving our yardstick, which is to the side that most supports a holistic and fair assessment of each individual application. And for our three arguments, which is leveling the playing field, secondly, guaranteeing a basic level of academic proficiency in relevant areas of knowledge, and thirdly, a component of being a holistic admissions process, is why we are very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Okay, I hope everyone can hear me. My dad went to IIT. He was 1 out of a million, but he dropped out of school in 3rd grade. Some of his friends took their own lives in the process, but he was the only one who passed. I'm grateful to be standing here today, but I wish he didn't have to sacrifice his entire childhood. I wish lives didn't have to be lost in the entire process. I'm so proud to propose. I think the one thing that both sides are forgetting right now is that if a student wants to submit an SAT score because they believe their grades are not representative of their situation, if a neurodivergent kid had a mental health crisis and they couldn't go to school, they can do so on our side of the house. We're not saying that we're abolishing the SAT. They can very much submit it and they can increase their chance of competitiveness if they want to. We are simply saying we're not forcing them to. So a lot of their argumentation about what about the kid with mental health with grades where grades don't actually represent who they are, we're saying take the SAT, submit it, but we're not forcing every single student to do so. Simply with this one line of analysis, by the way, that came out of first, Radhika literally told you that the delta in this debate is about the students who would not have submitted SAT scores. She told us in first. We literally take down a lot of their substantive material because they don't engage with the fact that, hey, this is very important by making it required for everyone. Okay, before I get down into my 3 paths to victory, a few rebuttals, right? And then this is coming out of the second opposition. They tell you this idea of like, oh, it's a benchmark level of assessment. We want to make sure students are ready for college. And you know what, judges, I completely agree. But that's exactly why when you're applying for a certain major, you have certain class requirements, certain levels of math, certain things that are literally written on the college website, which admissions officers are extremely aware of. And as William told you in his second speech, admissions officers who are literally regionally aware of how each education system works, they're aware and are able to understand what this looks like and what class requirements to ensure a basic level of understanding. We told you this, and then they also tell you that, oh, we want to create curriculums that are best suited to their needs. This is literally also allowed with, hey, you can go into the university, there's a lot of resources in universities once you enter, with guidance counselors, with teachers, with office hours. I think creating curriculums better suited to their needs, simply because they got a lower math score, is very superficial. Just because they can't do a little bit of algebra doesn't mean that you're now going to redesign their entire electrical engineering curriculum. They need to mechanize to this and prove why this is so substantial. It's simply not. Okay, now into the 3 paths to victory here. The first path is where are applications more fair? They give us a few valid rebuttals here. They tell you that grades are going to be inflated on our side of the house. To which we say, if grades are inflated for every student, that's going to be very apparent to the admissions officers. Because if now everybody in the school is getting A's, admissions officers are clearly able to see that and make holistic and accurate decisions about what teachers are giving to their students. Teachers have no incentive to do so because everything matters relatively. Because admissions officers are looking at tens of applications for a singular school. Grade inflation simply does not work as a valid mechanism. Then they tell you the idea of like, hey, it's an additional part of your application. And you know what, Judge? I completely agree. It is an additional part of your application. And if you think it's an important part, submit it. I'm not saying that you shouldn't submit your SAT score. I'm saying that I don't want to make you submit your SAT score. Then they get this idea of like elite padding and oh my god, you know, these people who have privileged backgrounds have more, you know, it's like another thing on their resume. We tell you that these students who are probably very smart from elite backgrounds would have gotten into these universities on either side of the house. We give you a very specific mechanism, filtration, something that they have not actually rebutted to in any of their speakers as of now. They've not rebutted the idea that, look, what we saw when SAT scores were required was that buckets were given to each SAT score. If you are in the lowest bucket, you only get 1 minute of reading time versus 15. What does that mean? That means that, look, you might have the greatest story out there, you might give the most compelling idea of how hardworking you are, but you're only being looked at for 1 minute. That means the chances of actually getting into the school drastically decreases. That is just simple mathematics. Whereas on our side of the house, you would have been given equal amount of time. You would have also gotten that 15 minutes. So you're having disadvantaged students who have certain contexts, mental health issues, everything that they're harping on their side of the house, being considered way more on our side, simply due to this mechanism of filtration. At the point in which they haven't rebutted that in 2 speakers when it came out in my first, I think they've already lost this debate. Okay, then what have we told you on our side of the house to make applications more fair? We told you 2 things, neurodivergent students and disadvantaged students. They tell you about the neurodivergent students that, look, they're probably going to get support anyways. We told you that this is not true. Look at a public school where support isn't there. Then they tell you that, hey, what if they're not good in their grades? You know what? If they're not good in their grades, can they do better on the SAT score? They can submit their SAT score. But the point is, we're giving them a choice. We also give you specific mechanisms as to why they're likely to show their true, academic ability through grades, because they have teacher support. they have people who know them. Whereas getting a private doctor to admit that you have ADHD and then getting that extra time is a very, very difficult process. Mechanism that came out of my first speaker and did not go responded to down the bench. Then we told you about disadvantaged students and how they have SAT lessons, they have transport, and they have so many privileges. They tell you that, look, some schools will have support and they brush it off. We again tell you not everyone has this privilege. I think we've already won on the idea that applications are much more fair on our side of the house simply through the idea of filtration, simply through the idea of time. Okay, I think we won this debate once, but let me prove to you why we win it again. Let's say you didn't buy anything I just said. Let me then prove to you our second path to victory, where are students' lives actually better? We told you a few things. We told you about the insane amount of stress that students in India, in China, are put under simply because they have to submit one single test score to decide their entirety of their life trajectory. We told you how students literally take their own lives, drop out of school in 3rd grade, how 1 out of 4 kids are the only ones that poor families are funding to go to these institutions. We told you in my second speaker that a lot of these maybe 1 in a million pass, but 999,999 fail. And I don't want to live in a world where these students have the potential to take their lives. What did they respond to with? Absolutely nothing. I don't think I've heard a single word out of second speaker as to why any of this is justified on their side of the house. At this point, I think we've already taken it. But we also told about scholarships and jobs and internships. They said like, oh, if they can't take the SAT, why can they now get a scholarships? Scholarships are inherently free, Judge. The whole point of scholarships is to fund someone and provide them the opportunity to go to college with extra funding. Internships are a much lower barrier to entry. I think submitting an application for an internship through paper or online is a much less damaging feat than paying hundreds of dollars, going to transportation for 3 hours and taking 4 hours out of your day for SAT. And even if you buy that, even the lessons to prepare for it. We tell you this, again, in the second speaker, and the response was very, very minimal. And then we tell you that we get way less stress and actually we get more lives saved on our side of the house. So at the point in which we literally save lives and go towards a system where holistic applications they've already conceded are a very good thing. And at the point in which they want more holistic applications, why don't we introduce that into places like India, into places like China? Because we're simply looking at the numbers, Judge. There are 4 to 5 billion. The majority of the world lives in these 2 countries. And if we can make their lives even 1% better by introducing the idea that a score does not define who you are, I think we've already won this debate. So at the point in which we prove to you why applications are fair on our side of the house and why students have a better quality of life on our side of the house, I think we've won this debate 2 times over. I'm so proud to propose.
I will be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Judges, on their side of the house, buckets still exist. The only difference is students don't know exactly what's in them and have zero control about which bucket they're put in. Well, I'll make it very clear to you today what's in those buckets. Money. Because on their side of the house, regardless of how much they want to harp on about how they are the more equitable side, they have proven time and time again down the bench why they simply cannot state this. But I'll first set up our counterfactual versus theirs. Our world looks like one where every student knows they have a quantitative metric against which they are assessed in the admissions process and an opportunity to display their current academic level. On their side of the house, students don't have that qualitative and quantitative metric simply because other metrics like grades, like essays, like extracurriculars, which they've already admitted they place more priority on their side of the house, are given more weight. And for this reason, there is less transparency and equality on their side of the house for this simple reason. We've already explained to you, I will take that later, why grades are not exactly an objective or standardized metric of intelligence. Even if they say on their side of the house that yes, all schools will not have the incentive to inflate their grades because admissions officers can see that and perceive a pattern, it still remains the case that they can inflate selectively certain grades and certain predicteds and certain measures of grades just to give certain students a better chance. So grades will never be an objective or realistic measure of academic potential that you can assess equally across different regions and different schools. And for this reason, their entire mechanism on what else they want students to be assessed on simply fails. I will take that below.
SAT classes take money too. Read this one.
SAT exams take money. This is an argument that we completely agree to and concede with. But what they fail to understand on their side of the house is when you make testing optional, what this means is that reality will never change. If everyone in the world has to take an SAT exam, this actually creates an incentive for education providers like, for example, Khan Academy, to create free resources to give more support to people who maybe can't afford SAT tutoring. There's also very little evidence that they can provide on their side to show why exactly this SAT coaching is so integral to the point that students simply cannot succeed without it. To this point, we will also say on our side of the house that we've said time and time again that students will be evaluated based on their community standards. If the average in your region, I will take that later, is an 1100 and you get a 1300, that will be viewed more favorably than a person in a very privileged boarding school in the United States who's getting a 1500 when the school average is a 1500. Therefore, this point on equality on their side of the house doesn't stand. So we can clearly see that our counterfactual, where there's more transparency in a world where you know exactly what and who you're being assessed to and compared against, is more equitable. And for this point, they fail on their entire yardstick, which was the most equitable system. I will take that POI.
If the SAT is so accurate, why does your side want to only be a small factor of college admissions?
We never said that the SAT should, our point was never that the SAT is the most accurate and therefore should always be considered to a large extent. The point was always that it is a component because of the fact that it is standardized. It can be used as a metric, and each university has different standards on how much weight they place on every component of the application. We'd like to also point out that this doesn't change on their side of the house. If someone is submitting a test optionally, the reality is only the people who are likely to perform very well on the SAT will submit their score, and this is something that they have conceded to. What this then does is people who are able to access resources or have the funding to get very high SAT scores will apply, making the average scores for these universities seem much higher. What this then does is students inside Proposition's world who could advantage from this contextual evaluation will be disincentivized from applying. If you're from a very underfunded school in, let's say, a country like the Philippines, and you're only able to get a 1400 where the regional average is a 1000, you'll still think, hey, Harvard says that the average SAT score that they admit is a 1530. Maybe I just shouldn't apply. But the reality is that student could actually benefit from, I will not be taking any more POIs. That student could actually benefit in our world, in our counterfactual, from submitting that SAT score because it would be evaluated in context. So on our side of the house, there is more equality in college admissions. So this is where I'll be weighing our two main flashpoints on fairness and quality of college decisions. I've already proven why fairness and equality exist more on our side, just simply because the mechanisms that they've set up themselves prove why lower income students or people who will actually be advantaged by submitting test scores won't actually do so under a test optional paradigm, which we saw during the COVID pandemic when test optional schools saw the average scores of SAT and ACT submissions skyrocket. So this is why on their side of the house, equality is not as promoted. Now they'll tell you, oh, but neurodivergent students can't get diagnoses for ADHD and so on because medical testing is expensive. Judge, this motion is not about the medical system or the flaws that exist within it, because those are inextricably linked with the resources a country and a society has. Instead, what can be said is colleges that do have a holistic admission system don't require you to always submit an ADHD diagnosis. They require you to prove why exactly you should be exempt or should be evaluated in the consideration of whatever intellectual or learning challenge that you have. So on our side of the house, these ADHD or neurodivergent students are still supported regardless of whether or not they have a diagnosis. So this point on their side of the house about better serving neurodivergent students doesn't stand. We'd also like to point out that the grading systems that are used in every country or in every society aren't always ones that neurodivergent students are able to succeed in. They themselves concede that a lot of schools and a lot of countries don't have the resources to metric that maybe more accurately reflects their academic potential than just their grades. Now, moving on to the second clash, which is the quality of college admissions. They argue
contradictory. Why? Because they keep on going on in their yardstick about how they're the side that best supports equity, but they never actually prove how. First, I would like to address their point about the JEE and the Gaokao. Even if the JEE and the Gaokao become test optional, what this means is that in countries like India and China, where grades are the only other factor of consideration in college applications, the importance of grades, which are subject to inflation, becomes even more exacerbated, and it places even more stress on students who think that grades are the sole and only and always will be the defining factor of their life and their academic success. Firstly, I will be comparing the arguments of side proposition and opposition side by side and prove why we win on our yardstick and our burden, as well as the burden we had to set for them and their yardstick. Firstly, I'll be tackling their argument of how they argue that standardized testing is an inaccurate measure of academic intelligence. To this we say, it was never meant to be a measure of academic intelligence. It's simply a method to measure academic understanding, which is tackled in our second argument, in that it sets a basic level of academic proficiency that one has to understand in their relevant area of knowledge. This is why their first argument simply does not stand, because they fail to understand the purpose of standardized testing. Their second argument is about how it promotes less reading time, and they talk about filtration. We argue that on their side of the house, filtration still exists, but this filtration is now focused even more on promoting people with higher socioeconomic status. Why? Because it's centered more around extracurriculars, essays, and grades. Whereas on our side of the house, we argue for a level playing field where people are considered within their own individual context, and SAT scores are evaluated under specific context. They argue that you can still submit SAT scores, but in the definition, which states that it gives students the best chance, they're only submitting SAT scores that they seem to think are high, and this actually skews the SAT scores in the long term. Our second argument is about how it promotes a basic level of academic proficiency in a relevant area of knowledge, and how we're setting a benchmark for which students can improve upon with their own college journey. Their third argument is about the signaling effect, and this talks about how making standardized testing required makes it signals to the world that this is a method of accurately measuring academic intelligence. Again, it is not about academic intelligence. In our world, we argue for a world where every student knows they have a quantitative measure on which they are assessed in college and the ability to discern current academic achievement. Therefore, Standardized test scores are not the sole determinant, they're just another aspect. Not a small aspect, not a big aspect, just a aspect, and a argument is about how it therefore is a component of holistic admissions. When you have standardized testing scores, it gives you another opportunity. On our side of the house, we are improving the fairness of college admissions decisions by making them more holistic, and our yardstick is of a fair and holistic assessment of each individual applicant. We also went on their burden because we prove that on our side of the house, we have a greater level of fairness and transparency in college admissions because of a level playing field for all applicants. Equity on our side of the house because everyone is able.
Sure. Even if we accept the fact that there is grade inflation and the average GPA in these schools is a 5.9 on a 4.0 scale, the 7.3 is still going to be better than the 6.0, right? So at that point, even though there's grade inflation, we're still effective at measuring who is excelling the most in these tough circumstances. And if you can do well in GPA, if you can do that well in school, we tell you can still take the SAT because we're test optional. And if you like that's the way you can demonstrate your aptitude, sure, we can do that too. But the point I want to make here about holistic admissions as well, which is very, very important, is even if you don't believe this, even if you say, okay, sure, the SAT is fully in context, it's just a small part of admissions. We tell you symmetrically you should apply that logic to GPA as well. GPA isn't going to be blown up like they say. Their characterization that's saying that without SAT, GPA is going to be the only thing we look at is very inaccurate because we think based on their line of logic that SAT is just a factor of admissions, so is GPA. But instead of two academic factors, we have one academic factor. And when you're doing the weighing here, it's very simple because we think if you have less pure academic factors, you're focused more on the extracurriculars, you're focused more on the story, the essays, the hardships that these kids have endured. We tell you that if you say that people of lower socioeconomic classes struggle with academic indexes, then they struggle symmetrically on either side. But because we only have one academic indicator instead of two academic indicators, we focus more on the other stuff in which they tend to do better in. Therefore, we think that these kids who are disadvantaged have a better chance of getting in with holistic admissions. Or, on the other side, if they say, like Optu suggests, that it truly is like a measure of basic proficiency because kids without the basic proficiencies in math and reading can't do as well in college as they suggest, then we think that's quite problematic because you're holding these kids to the same bar, to the same metric across different economic classes. We tell you, look at this in a very contextual manner. A kid with the highest GPA in a very struggling circumstance, because they've been mistreated by their community, because they're very poorly funded, they may do very bad on the SAT. On their side of the house, based on their own argument that you need basic proficiency to get in college, we tell you that this kid may not have the basic proficiency to get in college on their side of the house. But on our side of the house, because we recognize that this kid, despite all of their hard chance to be in university, even though they may not be as proficient as other kids, we tell you university is when they can finally have the resources to finally reach their potential. We think that is a much better comparative. Also, Judge, we tell you that we do better for millions of kids and families in India and in China, where standardized testing is so much more higher stakes. And we tell you can't simply give us a 1-minute rebuttal at the very end of your Op 3 speech when you brought this very early up in the debate. Therefore, we think you have to treat this argument as dropped. Even if you don't treat this as dropped, we think that they still have done a very lackluster job at rebutting this. When you weigh on a utilitarian metric, we think this impact far outweighs anything else in this debate. So proud to propose.
Announce here, or does it all announce in one place, like in the I'm going to assume very neat answers about my team.
But right now, lunch is in the cafeteria for you guys, so you should go get lunch. We have I-150, so that's what you definitely need to get. Thank you!
Usually I think the announcement is in the main place.
We need to let our house.
Yeah.
It drops?
Yeah, no, I got it back. Yeah. So you really not need to do it while it's broke. And then you just quickly stop yes. On the gear, when you get the URL and your server stream to right? And here, in the settings, the stream key, and there's your URL. Now,
Adele,
the problem is
can you open up one of those laptops for her and let her, she needs to submit her ballot.
this is not
Help her with the ballot.
I reset this one. So this is when you get that one. So you go there.